where a new chapter in American political history is waiting to be written if and when special counsel Jack Smith decides to make his move. We know the grand jury investigating former President Trump's role in trying to overturn the 2020 election arrived at the D.C. courthouse several hours ago. And if past is prologue, a decision on an indictment could come soon. In the classified documents investigation, Trump was charged just 3 days after his attorneys held a final meeting with Jack Smith. That same kind of meeting in this case was 5 days ago, if that provides us any clues. We want to bring in NBC's Garrett Haake, who's following this from Washington. Ryan Riley is outside the U.S. District Courthouse. Chuck Rosenberg is a former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official who is also an MSNBC contributor. And Michael Steele is former chairman of the RNC and an MSNBC political analyst. So, Ryan, what is the latest? What's happening in that courthouse behind you?
Well, you'll see behind me there's an increased security presence here at the courtroom. It's also the most reporters that I've seen inside the courthouse up until this moment in the months we've been sort of watching for the action from this grand jury. Just a lot of people gathered inside the foyer there waiting on news from this grand jury. The grand jury did take a lunch break, we know, the timing of that could suggest that they would be getting back very soon. But, all eyes are basically on this courthouse, just given the timeline as you sort of laid out. It seems like it is the time to be watching this courthouse and for this potentially historic potential indictment of the president in his connection with the lead up to January 6th. And remember, this doesn't only have to do with January 6th. It's about that period in the lead up after the election when there were these efforts. They've interviewed a lot of the fake electors who have been reporting to this courthouse and testifying before the grand jury. And of course, the biggest name that we've seen here thus far a few months back in April was former Vice President Mike Pence, who actually was testifying before the grand jury. So a really wide range of figures have sort of had their say before the grand jury here, including a lot of people in Donald Trump's circle, including an aide, William Russell, who has asked questions about what Donald Trump's state of mind was after the election, but leading up to January 6th. So we don't know, obviously, when that indictment will drop. We don't know what the contents of it will be, but given the breadth of the individuals that they spoke with, we can expect a pretty compelling narrative just based on what we've seen from Jack Smith's office thus far. They really do like to tell stories through these indictments and do a pretty fine job at it, really laying out the facts in the case in a really compelling manner. So I think, once this potentially really lengthy indictment hits, whenever that is, we'll all sort of be scrambling to go through those pages and make sense of what this investigation found, because there's a lot of stuff that they were able to touch that over across the hill here, Capitol Hill, that the January 6th committee wasn't able to get to. There's a lot more that federal investigators can do. So I think that, in conjunction with the investigation that the January 6th committee did, we could still expect some surprises, even with all of the journalism that has gone into reporting what Donald Trump was up to in those days after January 6th and, of course, in the lead up to January 6th itself.
And in those hours, Chuck, before a decision finally drops, give us a sense of what happens in that final meeting between the prosecutors, the federal prosecutors, and members of the grand jury.
Sure, Chris. Well, typically after the grand jury has heard from lots and lots of witnesses under oath, where the government locks in their stories, their narrative as evidence for a trial should one occur, the last meeting usually involves the government asking a summary witness, likely in this case an FBI special agent, to testify before the grand jury, to present in summary fashion the indictment, to go through all of the allegations and each of the charges. Once that's concluded, the agent and the prosecutors have to leave the grand jury room. The vote takes place in secret. Only the members of the grand jury can be present for the vote. When I was a federal prosecutor, I typically told the foreperson of the grand jury that we would be available in the hallway. If the grand jury had any additional questions, we'd be happy to come back in and answer them on the record. But the vote itself is an entirely private matter. It's done in secret, and the vote total is never made public, even though the outcome of the vote is. That's what the end stage of this looks like, Chris.
Okay, so Garrett, we heard from Donald Trump. He thinks this is going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. Are you hearing any rumblings from within his camp that beyond him, there is concern others might be indicted, or that there may be witnesses that can do serious damage to the president? What's the buzz inside Trump camp?
Well, look, there's a little bit of both. I mean, I think the first reality here is that they just don't know. I mean, this investigation has been so broad and has gone on for so long. They're in a similar position where we are, just trying to keep track of who the witnesses are, who've spoken, and as best they can figure out what they've said. And Chris, as best we know, and I've not seen any reporting in any other news outlet that contradicts this either, there have been no other individuals who've received target letters in this case. So the universe of other possible targets is presumably quite broad, but we've not gotten any, tip of the hat as to which direction it might go. But if you consider all the former lawyers and former aides who, for example, the January 6th committee suggested be brought up on charges at the end of their investigation, it is a pretty significant universe of people who might potentially also be charged. And the list of cooperators is kind of an interesting one, too. I mean, the person who appears on both of those lists, who's the first name I'm going to be searching for in any indictment that may or may not come out, is Mark Meadows. I mean, this is somebody who's been around, was right at the president's side during all of this time period when he was in the White House, someone whose text messages were basically the Rosetta Stone for the January 6th committee, and someone who's gone totally dark in public, really for the last several months. Whether he is which end of this indictment he might find himself on is something that I'm very interested in, and I know people in Trump's orbit are very interested in as well.
So, as Ryan pointed out, Michael, I mean, the J6 committee did a lot, but this grand jury heard surely more. They heard from more witnesses. They were privy to more evidence. The conventional wisdom in the polls would suggest that the more Trump gets indicted, the better it is for him. He makes more money. He gets more support in the polls. But is there anything you think could come out of this from Mark Meadows or anyone else that might change that calculation?
No, not really. His base believes he's legitimately acted in this regard, as president. They still see him as president. So they're, all of what the system is doing at this point in the light of, in the view of his base, rather, is, outside the ordinary. That's, from their perspective, that's the strange part. What's happening to him is not ordinary, because they see him as justified in having those documents. They see him justified in doing dynamically for Trump. In fact, it just locks him in a lot further. And what makes that even more so is that those running against him don't have the spine to lose the primary. In other words, go after Trump in a sufficient enough way that at least one of them is able to survive to take him on head to head and defeat him in this primary process. But that's not their risk. They don't want to take that risk. So Donald Trump right now still commands the field. He commands the outcome of this primary. And all of this that's going on legally is just, deep state interference.
At the risk of incrementalism, but that's where we are, Ryan Riley, I understand the grand jury is back.
Yeah, going back from lunch is our understanding. So obviously a very tight watch here. I think we'll all be able to sort out potentially what was really happening behind the scenes once all the sort of we know what ends up happening. If something does indeed happening this afternoon, we'll be able to piece together this timeline of what they were exactly doing potentially. But yeah, I think that we're just sort of all waiting and for there to be action out of here. As soon as I go back into the courtroom, I'm going to be going around to different doors, because how this has to come down, essentially, it's really actually kind of interesting. They have to do this in open court, even if it's a sealed case. They would typically use the initials. In this case, if we see a prosecutor from the special counsel come out and say, and then it's announced in court as DT or DJT, pretty good idea what's going on there. So that's really what we're going to sort of be watching for, is if they try to bring this into another courtroom. There is a magistrate judge who is on duty, who are sort of watching outside the courtroom there to make sure there's no action there. But theoretically, it could be in any of the courtrooms throughout the building, and all they have to do is technically unlock the door and then say, okay, yes, this happened in open court. So it's a little bit, we might actually have for some producers physically running through the halls, just sort of checking doors in the next few hours.
Well, let's hope they're up to the task. Let me go back to Chuck, what we heard from Garrett, which is that he's going to be watching very closely to see how Mark Meadows fits into all this. Was he somebody providing testimony? Is he potentially a target himself? What are you looking for out of any indictment potentially?
Yeah, I agree with Garrett. I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting questions about which side of the line a number of these people will fall. Chris, I don't have any special information about Mark Meadows other than this. He was around the president during the events that the grand jury and the special counsel's office are keenly interested in. Why are they so interested in what someone like Mark Meadows would have to say? It's because in a case like this, the government has to prove intent. In order to prove intent, you want to know what someone was thinking. To know what they were thinking, you want to know what they were told and what they said. And who better than the White House Chief of Staff, the president's #1 aide, to give you some insight into what the president was hearing, saying, thinking, and doing. So I don't know if he'll be charged or not. I'm not rooting one way or the other for people to be charged. I imagine the special counsel will make principled decisions about which side of the line these people fall on. But you will need some number of witnesses who had proximity to the president to help explain to the jury what Mr. Trump's intent was.
So, Garrett, lots of stories out there today about how much all of this is costing Donald Trump. NBC News is reporting that his Save America PAC has spent more than $20 million on legal fees just this year, roughly 2/3 of its spending. The New York Times says that same PAC had more than $100 million at the start of last year. That's down to $4 million. What more can you tell us about all this?
Well, Chris, some of this is a matter of confusing accounting because of all the different vehicles that the Trump campaign uses to raise money, to spend money. There's this PAC, there's a super PAC that's mostly supposed to spend money on ads. There's the campaign itself. But the upshot is this. Defending Donald Trump and his allies in all of these various legal cases, providing attorneys for people who either worked for him or worked with him, who found themselves wrapped up in this, has become enormously expensive. And it's a huge drag on the cash resources of the kind of greater MAGA movement as it stands supporting Donald Trump. This is before any of these cases go to trial. It's before at least 2 cases that we know are being investigated or even indicted if that's the direction they're going. So this will continue to be a drain on resources for the former president going forward. Now, if you give money to Donald Trump through his website or through something like WinRed online, you're giving to a split between the campaign and this PAC. So some of this is donor money. I think the big question is, at some point, will Donald Trump, the billionaire businessman behind Donald Trump, the presidential candidate, start spending more of his own money on these legal issues, both for himself and for all of his various allies? He is notorious for trying to not spend his own money on his political or legal ventures until he has to. At this burn rate, that time may come sooner rather than later.
People can't see you, but I can, Michael Steele. What was that look on your face as Garrett was talking? Chris Christie suggested today, why doesn't he sell a Trump Tower? Why doesn't he sell a boat? Why doesn't he sell a golf course and stop taking money from his constituents? I don't think that's going to happen.
No, I don't either, and that's why I was kind of snickering when Garrett's reporting there, because he's right. I mean, ostensibly that's what you think would happen. But Donald Trump does. If Donald Trump knows he can get somebody else to foot the bill, he's not putting up his own cash. So it won't be until that money starts to slow coming into the campaign coffers and the various vehicles that he's using to set up the grift that he will then have to and be forced to look at bringing in those dollars from his personal assets. Why? Because then his lawyers will begin to shut down. And they will be like, I'm sorry, we just can't do this at this burn rate without payment. So Garrett's right, but the reality for Donald Trump is if he knows there's a sucker out there that's going to send him $100 or allow him to put $100 on their credit card every month, guess what he going to do?
Garrett Haake, Ryan Riley, and Chuck Rosen.